So this, Prince Creek down to the Horseshoe Canyon, that's well over 1,500 or 2,000 kilometers. It's a huge distance. So the question is, are these dinosaurs just really widely distributed, or are they spending time in one locality and migrating south for the winter and then back north for the summer? Something like this. So this was sort of what I'm looking to see. So it's important to keep in mind what was the paleogeography of the area. So this is a modified figure from Bell from 2014. And the three locations I've highlighted again. And as you can see, the Prince Creek Formation was even farther north than it is today, 80 degrees latitude. This is a location that would definitely experience 24 hours of darkness for a significant portion of the year. So if you're looking at a large dinosaur like a hadrosaur, they presumably have high food needs, and would there be enough vegetation in the winter to sustain them? This is a question that is debated by a lot of other people, but not me. I'm actually not interested in that. I'm just looking to see if I can see evidence that they've actually been moving. So if you've been a fan of watching dinosaur movies, you might have seen this movie back in 2013, Walking with Dinosaurs by the BBC. Which I found really interesting because they took a group of dinosaurs that are believed to possibly might be migrating, the ceratopsians, and they based this on the fossil finds in Alaska. Unfortunately, they also based the climate on modern Alaska instead of fossil Alaska. So here we have pachyrhinosaurs crossing a frozen lake in the Arctic, because reasons, I guess. So, for my studies, I'm looking for isotopes of strontium, so you have to choose what fossils you are going to study very carefully. So, when looking at dinosaurs, you're looking at hard tissues. You have many choices. You can look at the bones, you can look at the teeth, and within the teeth you can look at either the enamel or the dentin. And what you really want to look at is the enamel. Bones and dentin are much more porous. You're much more likely to have diagenetic overprinting. So if you want that original biological signal, you go for the enamel. So this has been done with oxygen isotopes for a few studies, so I'm just going to quickly highlight those. One was on sauropod migration, where the authors were examining oxygen isotopes preserved in the enamel of the teeth and comparing them to the oxygen isotopes in paleosol carbonates in the area that they were found. And what they did see, the red bars here represent the teeth, while the green bars represent the paleosols. There was a wide variety seen in the teeth that went well beyond the extent of what they were seeing in the paleosols. So this led to the conclusion that the dinosaurs must have been migrating out of the area for part of the year, and the hypothesis here was that they were migrating towards the west and into the uplands where the oxygen isotopes might have dropped to more negative values. A similar study was done on hadrosaurs. So hadrosaurs are an ideal target for this type of study because they replace their teeth very rapidly. And potentially, in the jaw of a single individual, you could have teeth from the entire year preserved. So you could potentially do an entire sort of seasonal migration study here. So again, same authors actually looked at hadrosaur migration by looking at oxygen and carbon isotopes preserved in the dinosaurs, or in hadrosaurs, from 5 different localities of similar age in Canada and the United States. And their conclusions were that there weren't a lot of overlaps between the northern formations and the southern formations. The dashed line on the graph represents the split between north and south. It's a bit of a busy figure. For the most part, I think they're correct. However, there does appear to be some overlap between the Fruitland Formation in the south and the Judith River Formation in the north. So the question is, why am I looking at strontium? So strontium is a little bit different from oxygen isotopes. One of the big things that's an advantage is that strontium is more tightly tied to the geography and geology of the area. This is because strontium in the ecosystem gets there primarily through the weathering of bedrock and upstream rocks. There are a few other sources, but those are the primary sources. So in a given river system, you might have a very strictly contained strontium isotope signature. So these here are modern rivers in Western Canada, in British Columbia, and I've highlighted the strontium isotope ratios on the right for each of those rivers. And as you'll notice, the 2 in the south that go through the Columbia Mountains have a much higher strontium isotope ratio than those in the north. So it's very distinct. But I also want to point out the Nass River and the Skeena River because they're very close, they're parallel to each other for the most part, and yet the variation is on the third decimal place, which might not seem like a big deal, but it's actually pretty significant. So this shows that even over short geographic distances, you can get pretty significant differences in the isotopes. So here I've created a very hypothetical, very simplified model for what Alberta might have been like with 3 hypothesized strontium isotope regions. And the idea is that if you have a hadrosaur that's migrating north-south, it'll pass through all 3 of those regions, and you should be able to see isotope data in its teeth belonging to each of those regions. But to figure out what the strontium isotopes were like in those individual regions, I've turned to what I'm finding in the enamel of microfossils. Things like fish scales, Mylodaphus teeth, crocodile teeth, organisms that are much less likely to be migrating long distances and are perhaps constrained physically to a local area. So this is how I'm getting my data for each of the locations that I'm going to compare to my hadrosaur. So what I'm showing you here is the very initial data I got for this study. This was from a microfossil assemblage provided to me from the Terrill Museum. And these were all just loose fossils collected from the same site. So I had hadrosaurs, small theropods, so those are things like Saurontholestes, crocodiles, Mylodaphus, and gar scales. And the big thing to take away from this initial data is that the hadrosaurs are much more varied. They have a much wider range of values than you see in the supposedly non-migratory taxa. So this is a promising start. I then moved on, collected some material myself from the park. This is all from Dinosaur Provincial Park, by the way, in the Dinosaur Park Formation. So I went to Dinosaur Provincial Park and collected from a second locality and added that data to the graph. So this is mostly crocodilian teeth and a few gar scales, and again, it's pretty conservative. So within the formation, in different localities, you're getting fairly conservative values for these non-migratory taxa. And finally, I took a hadrosaur jaw that I found in the Badlands of Dinosaur Provincial Park. Wasn't in very good shape by the time I found it, but there were lots of teeth that had eroded just immediately below it. So I was very confident they're all from the same individual. And this is where the data from that individual plotted. So it's not plotting as low down as the individual loose hadrosaur teeth, but it is trending to higher values than what you see in the non-migratory taxa. Now finally, I do want to highlight a few special, oh, there's my jaw. I want to highlight a few special data points. These 3 here are, I intentionally drilled the dentin out of a tooth to see what it would look like. This is also a dentin sample from a gar, and that's another dentin sample from a hadrosaur tooth. So I'm trying to demonstrate here that if you have diagenetic overprinting, which you would expect to see in the dentin, the values are going to be very conservative. There's very little variability between any dentin sample that I looked at, regardless of what sample it came from. So we can be fairly confident that the enamel samples from the hadrosaurs are showing me an original signal here. So now that I have data from an individual from Dinosaur Provincial Park, it's time to compare it to a few other localities. So I was loaned some material from the Terrill Museum again. From these 2 localities at the red dots. One's north of a town called Medicine Hat. It's about 80 to 90 kilometers away from Dinosaur Provincial Park, the yellow dot. And then the red dot down by the border in the south, way down by the American border, is about 300 kilometers away. So 2 locations with a little bit of distance, but they are all time equivalent to the Dinosaur Park Formation in Dinosaur Provincial Park. And here's what the data looks like from those samples. So the green box on the left, that's my original data set that I showed you. The blue box is the dinosaur, the individual jaw. And then the red boxes represent the Old Man Formation, which underlie the Dinosaur Park Formation. So I wanted to see if the Old Man Formation in Dinosaur Provincial Park would show me something different, and it did. But then the Dinosaur Park Formation down in the 1-4 area, that's down by the border, that is actually the time equivalent strata to the Dinosaur Park Formation at Dinosaur Provincial Park. And it's very different. There's no overlap with my jaw. However, the Dinosaur Park Formation at the South Saskatchewan River site near that town of Medicine Hat does have some overlap. So there appears to be maybe my jaw is somewhere in between. So I did a little bit of statistics, not my strong suit, it's math. But I did a Tukey test. So a Tukey test, besides sounding like some kind of bird, is a statistical test where you put in information or you put in data from a few different locations and you try and see if it's going to group them together. So in theory, it's looking to see if my hadrosaur jaw actually belongs to the Dinosaur Park Formation data, or if it fits better with the Saskatchewan River data, or if it doesn't fit with either and it's kind of on its own. And what the Tukey test said was that it's on its own with a very high significance, p-values significantly less than 0.01. So it is very intermediate between the two. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that there is one other study that has looked at strontium isotopes. This is from an unpublished thesis looking at the Prince Creek Formation. And their isotopes from the Edmontosaurus plots significantly higher. So you're looking at 0.708 roughly to 0.709. And if you put that on my graph, that's putting it, so 0.7088, significantly above. Some of the lower values though, 0.7084 is a little bit above the Old Man Formation in the 1-4 area, but it's not overlapping at all. So I'm fairly confident that my hadrosaur is not wandering up to Alaska. In fact, if we look at the distance there, like I said, this is less than 100 kilometers. It's about 80 to 90 kilometers that this dinosaur appears to be moving based on my limited data set. It would be nice to add some sets a little bit more to the north maybe, but we are restricted to where you can find strata of appropriate age. My current conclusion is that the dinosaur might be migrating, but that its distance of migration is under 100 kilometers. And this is actually fairly consistent with elephants in the modern era. So modern elephants, a lot of them don't migrate, but the ones that do, the migrations tend to be on these sort of 15 to 80 to maybe 100 kilometers distance total. So we're not looking at the wildebeest here. They're not migrating thousands of kilometers, which strongly suggests that the dinosaurs, the hadrosaurs, while they might move around, they're not, their distribution is more based on a wide distribution of species, not so much on moving huge distances. Now, in the future, I would like to kind of take this, that's the next slide, sorry. So just quick conclusion, strontium isotopes can be used to differentiate migratory taxa from non-migratory taxa. Evidence does exist from the strontium isotopes that hadrosaurs were migrating, but the migration timing, I can't tell from my data so far, nor can I understand quite the reason right now, because paleogeographically, those two locations are almost identical from an environmental standpoint. And then migratory distances are similar to modern megaherbivores, such as elephants. And just to wrap it up, what I'd like to do in the future, and I'm going to be able to, because I just got a grant from the Jurassic Foundation, is I'd like to look at ceratopsians next. So see whether or not they could have truly wandered the ice fields of Alaska in the midst of winter. So I'd just like to thank Dr. Don Brinkman for his help on this and getting me some samples, the Terrill Museum as well for providing me with fossils, the Dinosaur Research Institute for funding, and Carrie Miller, who helped me with the analysis. And with that, thank you very much.